gentlemen, thank you to be the early birds for the very first morning session. My name is Tian Wei. I'm a TV host coming from CGTN. This is a joint session between the World Economic Forum and CGTN. The topic we're to discuss today is resisting autarky. As we know, tariffs, export controls, investment screenings, these have become commonly used tools by governments. Meanwhile, we are also seeing the world is getting ever more complex, as we these days always say. Wars, conflicts, plus innovation. These are bringing new possibilities, but at the same time, new challenges to many on the global supply chains and many businesses around the world. And that is why we are gathering capable minds together today to tackle the challenges, but at the very beginning, to understand exactly what is going on and what might be the solutions. As a journalist, I see it from my perspective. However, as a moderator, it is my great pleasure to see we have capable minds sitting here coming from both academic businesses to bring ideas together. And that is the charm of the World Economic Forum, as we all know. So without further ado, may I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce to all of you the panelists sitting here today. I would go with the list that was being provided by the organizer. Yue Ang, Alfred Chandler Chair Professor of Political Economy with Johns Hopkins University. And Matthew Klein, who is the founder of the Overshoot. He earlier worked as a journalist as well. Thank you. Yasushi Sasaki, Managing Director and Senior Partner with Asia Pacific Chair of Boston Consulting Group, BCG. Good to see you. Last but certainly not least, Elizabeth Thurbo, Professor of International Political Economy and Director from the University of New South Wales. Good to see all of you. May I start by asking a very general question, then we can go deeper into the discussion. So, are we seeing today just a temporary phenomenon of the so-called national security as the priority, or this is already settling down to be the theme for all of us for years to come? Professor An.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to share this panel with Tian Wei and other distinguished panelists. I think I would start by pointing out the rather surreal nature of the title of this session, because I think if we imagine 10 years ago, if you had a session at the World Economic Forum with the word autarky, I think many people might react with, what is that? Because it's a word we have abandoned into the history books of planned economy. So it's quite a statement of our times that this word has been brought back. But I would caution against the idea that we can balance trade integration and autarky, that we can be dependent without being vulnerable. And to use an analogy that is actually right in front of me, I would ask everyone a question. Can you open and close the door at the same time? And some people might say, yeah, sure, you can open it halfway. But if you think about it, in our regular lives, we don't open the door halfway because it's the worst of both worlds. It doesn't keep you safe, and you might just bruise yourself because you keep running into a half-open door. And if we look at the real world around us today, tariffs, export controls, investment screening.
And the list goes on.
And the list goes on. They often backfire. Tariffs have not helped to reduce trade deficits. They have increased costs. Export controls can ironically spur indigenous innovation on the other side. And so I'll be very careful about making this assumption that we are able to have it both ways.
Thank you very much. I love that analogy of the door half open. What about for you, Mr. Klein? Your thoughts on the general question, can you open the door and close the door at the same time?
No, I'm not sure. I don't think it's.
By the way, it will not be a test for everybody on the panel.
Riddle of the session.
That's right. Can we get out of here safely without hitting ourselves? I'm not sure I would think of it necessarily in this sort of linear, or binary way of opening or closing. I think to your original question, though, I think the reason that autarky, or to use a less, triggering word, self-sufficiency has become more popular over the past few years is because there have been many events globally that make people feel unsafe, and that a lot of the assumptions they had about how the global economy could function well have been undermined. I think it started really most acutely with the pandemic, when a lot of things people took for granted, their ability to access material goods, they couldn't get them because transportation was, factories were shut down, or transportation was not available, or there were limited shortages of things people needed. And then there was Russia invading Ukraine and other things of this nature that suddenly make people much more aware. And so it's the question of, if you are feeling unsafe, it's a price to pay. You could call it closing a door halfway or what have you, but I think it is a reasonable response to get what I would think of as buying insurance. It never feels good to be paying for insurance when you don't actually need it. But if it comes a time when you do actually need that kind of, you suddenly need to make a claim and you have that ability, that is, you're going to be glad you have it. And even not in that, if you don't even need to make a claim, if you aren't actually hurt, simply having that sense of confidence that it's there for you when you need it, I think it's understandable why it's happened. I mean, I remember during the pandemic and talking with people, this is in like the spring of 2020, and at that point, one of the concerns was that farm workers wouldn't be able to pick fruits and vegetables because they were getting sick, and where would food come from? And one of the things I learned from this is that a lot of the big growers, they would have maybe 90% of their food they would grow in some places, and they'd have sort of 10% grown somewhere totally else. Yeah. And it wasn't based on the idea that their farm workers would get sick, but maybe there's some freak weather event. And I think this idea of not necessarily going from complete dependence to complete independence or autarky or what have you, but some kind of 80-20, 90-10. I suspect that probably will be something we see for a long time in response.
Very interesting, that pendulum shift. But will that be the eventual result, Mr. Sasaki?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, first of all. It's a fascinating topic. My answer to your question is, I think that, nothing is permanent and nothing is temporary.
Very philosophical.
Yes, it is. As a consultant, I have visited more than 15 countries, and I met more than 100 CEOs, I think, bilateral meeting, and then particularly in this region. And then my sense is, I think that everyone understands that nothing is predictable. That is a really common sense among the business leaders. I think this uncertainty remains for the time being. But at the same time, I feel that strong sense of the entrepreneurship. Even that everything is unpredictable, they need to survive, and they need to be entrepreneur. And they need to redesign that and what they are doing, I think, in a smart way. So that is a reality on the business front. And how do we deal with it? I think that's from here. But I can go deeper, but let me pause here that, to answer your question, that nothing is predictable. That is where we are today. Yeah.
I love that philosophical answer. Of course, you need to provide the details a bit later.
Yes.
I'd love to hear more. And Professor Thurbong, your thoughts on that? Is it more philosophical we need to get? Or actually people are really having practical answers to the big question we posed at the very beginning?
Yes, and let me echo my thanks for being here. What a fantastic group of discussants. And to speak to the original question, will security continue to dominate our economic policy making, and will we continue to see this, kind of bizarre emergence of a quest for autarky in some arenas? I think it's true, obviously. Geostrategic security is the overarching lens through which so many countries are viewing their economic engagement at the moment, and that is having a quite negative impact, obviously, quite detrimental impact. But geostrategic security, military security is just one dimension of security. There are many other dimensions of security that urgently require our attention, and I hope that we will focus on these dimensions of security going forward. Energy security is obviously important, but also social security, creating good jobs, which is also really important in terms of avoiding political polarization. Environmental security, it's crucial that we have a huge focus on environmental security. This geostrategic conflict is taking place in the context of the existential challenge of climate change. So the question really isn't, will security diminish, but will we find a way to think about balancing and perhaps reconciling these competing dimensions of national security? I think at the moment there has been a tendency to view these in terms of trade-offs. You can't have energy security and economic competitiveness, or you can't have economic competitiveness and job creation. And so there's been this focus on kind of managing trade-offs. But actually the real governance challenge, I think, across the globe is how do you actually govern in a way that advances economic, environmental, energy, social, and geostrategic security simultaneously. I think that's the challenge for governments. It's not an easy challenge, but that's where we could productively focus our attention.
That's a great point. It's not just black and white, it's rather how you manage it comprehensively. Can business community communicate with the policymakers, have good results at this moment? Are they depending on that to have solutions?
I think dependent is not the right word, but they fully understand the collaboration, cooperation with the nation-state government is becoming more and more critical. I think that's a mandate. Going back to my discussion with the CEOs, two topics. One is the geopolitics, but the other is AI. Today AI may not be the key theme for this session, but I think these are the two topics always. And then it's
too early to say that, my friend. A bit later, we're going to tackle that.
Okay. Thank you. But going back to that on the topic of the geopolitics, geoeconomics, I think one key example is supply chain. Thinking about that, key critical inputs like semiconductors, raw materials, and others. I think they all need to think about that, how much they can be efficient in the past. Concentration has been that one key dogma for the business leaders, but today they need to diversify. But to some extent, diversification, I think that it depends on the context, it depends on the situation. So they need to be adaptive, they need to be flexible. That's also the reality. They can't determine that this should be the right degree of the soap. So that's a reality, and then they are thinking. And then in that context, cooperation with the government is really, really critical because they need to shape the agenda, not only for their own company, but also for the industry, but for the state.
A few adjectives: flexible, they need to be adaptive.
Yes.
That costs like billions of dollars.
Yes.
So how do you see businesses? I would love to go to other speakers a bit later, but really, how do you see businesses are coping, are adapting, are being flexible? Any good advice or good practices already that you have witnessed over the past few years?
If possible, that business leaders can think that the mid to long term basis, so that they can optimize, even if there's ups and downs of the trend. That is a key thing. But I think it depends on that and what type of the corporate governance you are running. But hopefully that will be one foundation. Then they can think not only just a single year analysis, but the multi-year analysis, how they can optimize. Even if there's ups and downs in the political stage, they can normalize in good way. And then one more thing is, no great CEOs think that stability is given. That is not given. They need to shape the agenda by themselves, more the spontaneity. I think that more actively. And that shift, I think I've clearly observed, I think that changed over the last 6 years, 6 months, yeah.
Well, 6 months
already
a
like
very long time right now because things are changing by the day, right? Yue, your thoughts on that? Do you see businesses are really figuring out a solution of being flexible and adaptable, or actually they are facing with new questions every day?
I think I would still insist on the black and white difference, either you close or open. But I think the different way of thinking is that the way you can get around that is not having some mixture of openness and closeness, but actually using non-trade tools to build resilience.
Be more specific.
If we want to look for lessons, we actually would have to look to small nations for lessons. Because for big nations, they have easy access to geoeconomic tools. They can impose tariffs, export controls, but if you think about it, the vast majority of countries in this world just cannot have access to these options. Autarky is off the table from the very start. So take Singapore, where I come from. It's a small nation, completely open. Without trade, like Singapore would not even have the most basic essential goods and services that we need, and Singapore sells to the world. So the way Singapore copes as a highly integrated small nation is not to protect markets, but to protect people. In water access, for instance, Singapore is willing to invest in extreme diversification, including even desalination, which is an expensive technology. And Singapore is not alone. Another example I can think of is Denmark, very strong social protections, so that in the event of shocks from globalization or pandemic, the people are protected. Right. But conversely, if you look at the US, even though it has a vast and powerful arsenal of geoeconomic tools, it was not able to protect Rust Belt workers from the shocks of globalization. So maybe the conversation is the options that we have should not just be limited to geoeconomic tools, autarky, but actually thinking outside the door, if we could continue with that analogy.
And shall I say it's thinking outside the door, but also it's common sense, isn't it? It's an issue of governance and capacity, capabilities of governance, and also interactions with the other factors of the society. Elizabeth, that seems to go to your point. So if I could elaborate even more, what exactly is national security? Because we see that word so frequent. I'm a second language using English, so I did look up what is autarky, by the way, in a dictionary, because my phrases are more about globalization time. But obviously, we need to adapt, as Mr. Sasaki earlier suggested. But exactly what is national security? I understand it from the surface, but do we really understand? Are we all on the same page, Elizabeth?
Look, that's an excellent question, and could I just endorse Wen's excellent point too about autarky really being a large economy luxury, and not even a luxury actually that makes economic sense. From a small country too, like Australia, 25 million people, you know, our economic prosperity, our security, our economic security really depends, and our social security therefore, depends crucially on our integration, on our ability to export and to import the things that we need. So autarky is not even something that we could possibly entertain. But I think that this distinction of policy tools, you know, actually I should go back and say, I think too that autarky is really a very mercantilist mindset, a really zero-sum, win-lose understanding of international trade. Whereas there is a different way of thinking about trade to advance security comprehensively conceived, economic security, social security, that is a more win-win, but that doesn't come about through unfettered free markets, as we've seen, particularly in the United States. Unfettered free markets tends to deliver poor social outcomes, poor environmental outcomes, poor economic outcomes in many circumstances. This is about pursuing security by using behind-the-border mechanisms to build our techno-industrial capability and to enhance our ability to engage in trade productively. Let me give an example from Australia. At the moment, we are one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters. We export our coal and our gas largely to East Asia to fuel manufacturing industries. But of course, environmentally, this is not a sustainable future for us. And economically, it's not sustainable because Northeast Asia is, of course, decarbonising rapidly, led by China. So the question is, how do we adjust our economy? How do we adjust our existing economic model to shift from that fossil fuel base to a renewable system that will support future economic, environmental and social security? And the task there is to use the ability of the government to crowd in private investment to start exporting, say, for example, not regular iron to feed steelmaking, but green iron, all in ways that are compliant with our WTO obligations, but then also to work with our Northeast Asian trading partners to build and grow markets for green commodities, collaborating on green standards, collaborating on the trade of environmental attributes. This is a kind of open economy economic nationalism, a positive outward-looking economic nationalism, which is where the future lies.
How do you see, Matthew, the word national security? It's been flowing interpretations over the past few months, to say. What about right now? How do you see its definition?
National security is one of those words that mean many different things depending on who you ask. I remember about 20 years ago, there was a debate about, I think it was the yogurt maker Danone in France, and it was, the merger was blocked on national security grounds by the French government for making yogurt. So what counts as national security, there's a long history of that being abused in different ways. I think when we talk about the question of autarky, I believe the only government that is currently extant that has endorsed autarky in any way is North Korea. As far as I know, which in the sense of literally trying to not be, even then not successfully. By the way,
that's one of those rare examples.
Right,
but can we focus more on the overall economies that we're talking about here today?
I think it's also obviously, if we can be confident that the relationships, the transactions that we're accustomed to, the investments you've made abroad are going to be there, and those flows will be persistent over different states of the world, it doesn't make sense to do things to alter them, because if businesses, profit-seeking businesses look for the best places to invest and develop those relationships, that's why they exist. Anything you deviate from that should, in principle, make you poor overall. The problem is people don't have the confidence that those investments will necessarily be honored, that those transactions will necessarily be possible, that those trade flows will be sustainable for whatever reason. And if you aren't confident that you can continue to import certain things that you need, then the question becomes, how do you protect against the possibility that you might not be able to? And this is certainly a lot.
And how many possibilities are there?
Well, that's the problem. Right, so you could imagine a world where you sort of go to the extreme and say you have to be able to make everything at home. But that is obviously extraordinarily expensive and inefficient.
Right.
And so nobody wants to do that. And then people say, well, we should prioritize. And then you look at what the list of people thinks they say. And then, this has certainly been a live conversation in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. And certainly in China, this is certainly a big policy, Japan. But people can say, oh, well, you need to have chips. Okay, you need to have certain kind of magnets or metals or fossil fuels. Australia exports a lot of raw fossil fuels, but no refining capacity for those. So it was actually a huge problem of not having access to gasoline or jet fuel and having to, do a lot of emergency deals with Japan and Korea to be able to get, even though a large net exporter in those. So, being able to access those things. But then you could say, for example, in the United States, I believe 100% of car seats in the United States are made in China. Now, that seems fine.
Well, we probably need to do a survey about that to know the exact number.
I think it's an extraordinarily high number, car seats and strollers. Yeah. And now, right, it's not a problem, right? It's not like there's a mass constituency of people in the United States saying we want to make car seats for ourselves. There's not people saying that we're not going to have access to Chinese car seats. But obviously, if you're just sort of if you're mechanically saying, well, where are your dependencies? Where do things come from? 100% from one country or whatever. You could imagine a situation like, well, that seems, if you the same list that people say like a rare earth magnet, if dysprosium is a national security concern, like why not a car seat? I'm not saying that either one necessarily is, right? But this is what makes this kind of analysis very challenging, and it's why you have lots of arguments of what constitutes national security. You could say nothing. You could say many, many, many things. And the problem is a lot of things you think of as being, it turns out being necessary, people didn't think about. Like people never thought about face masks as being as something you needed to be able to get in size until 2020, for the most part. And then suddenly everyone realized we would need to be able to do that. Or then.
Very
so
interesting.
That's a challenge.
You give several examples, for example, about the pandemic. I would love to share with everybody a Chinese traditional saying. By the way, we have traditional saying about many things. There's one called, once you're bitten by a snake, you're afraid of the rope for 10 years. But we hope we can graduate from that 10 years as soon as possible, right? Having said that, though, well, you are talking about the possibilities of national security going everywhere. Mr. Sasaki was kind of calmly looking at you, but I really wonder what is going on in his mind because businesses.
I tried to be snake.
Right? Because business leaders have been telling us over the past few years. So difficult it is. They have to adjust every time when the policies are changing to so many different economies. So, Mr. Sasaki, I give you a floor to talk about it.
No. Thank you. I love your analogy of saying the outside door concept, but that leads to the question, how do we define the role of the government? And then my understanding, nothing has changed the responsibility of the government, I think, at least, over the years. I think government is responsible for the social welfare, I think infrastructure. I think that hasn't changed. Large state, small state, that hasn't changed at all. But what has changed over the last 6 months is because of the export control, because of the energy crisis. It's beyond that. How do we set that, the role of a government beyond that, the traditional scope? I think that is a way I interpret. And then that is based on the discussion with the business leaders. And then they start thinking that, okay, this is really, really attacking my own business. And then I need to collaborate with the government. Otherwise, I can't survive. That's a true voice I heard. So fundamentally, they trust that their own government. That's why they are making that, their business in each state. But I think the situation has changed a lot.
Right.
And then how much I can step further to strengthen my position in collaboration with the government, I think that will be the key theme I have in my mind. Yeah.
Businesses are getting ever more practical.
Yeah.
And knowing to a certain extent the limits of governments, their capabilities of handling the situation. And sometimes businesses probably, with their operations worldwide, have a better understanding of what exactly is going on and better understanding of the tools that they have, for example, AI. By the way, I'm going to talk about that later. Okay, so go to you, Elizabeth, on that too.
Yes, this is a really interesting observation about the role of the government and it not having changed. From sitting from an Australian perspective, I think this is really the key question that we are asking ourselves, because for a very long time, it's been understood in my country that the role of the government is simply to provide an adequate framework of rules in which the free market can operate. And it's not the business of the government to get involved in thinking about the industrial structure of the nation. It doesn't matter if we produce potato chips or computer chips. We'll let the market sort out and domestic industrial structure doesn't matter. But I think, to your point, COVID, along with all sorts of other disruptions, climate change, the energy crisis, have taught us that actually industrial structure matters. What our economies look like on the inside matters. Domestic capability matters. So this forces, especially in the West, because, of course, in East Asia, the understanding of the purpose of the government has always been much more expansive. But in the West, we've had a very, very narrow view of what it's appropriate for the government to do. So meeting this challenge, this comprehensive national security challenge, now requires a fundamental rethinking of the role of the government. In its core, this national security challenge is a challenge of mindset, a shift in understanding of what governments can and should do, Of course, not displacing markets, but acting strategically behind the border, not at the border, to build those capabilities in ways that allow us to still benefit from the enormous security-enhancing opportunities of international trade and investment, but without undermining our domestic capabilities.
There are two parts to this statement that you just make, which I think very interesting. On the one hand, the governments are exercising, their learning curve, so to speak, around the world, and we should give them time. It's only sensible that we're giving them time, just like everything else. But on the other hand, how much time should we give them? And how much will policies, change the overall landscape that we are talking about here today? How much businesses have to lose in order to let the governments, so to speak, or the policymakers become more matured or more capable? And meanwhile, how much does it take to see the overall picture, as the picture is always evolving? These are wonderful questions coming out of the important opinions that you just shared. I would like to go to you, Yue, on that too, your thoughts on that, because these are two scholars, so they can talk with free spirit. So I would love to come to you on that as well, Yue. So go ahead.
All right, in free spirit, I'll echo everyone's insights. But Tianwei, I think you have actually underscored the key word for us, which is time. So unpredictability is going to be an enduring feature of the world, both for governments and companies alike. But
the question is, should we just let it be, or should we do something, right?
Yes, they will absolutely have to do something, right? But the key for governments and companies to do the right thing has a lot to do with their time horizon, whether they think short term or long term. And one of the key challenges of our times is that increasingly our time horizon is getting short, both for governments and even for companies, because companies are under constant pressure to deliver quarterly, right? So within a company, do you do just in time or do you do just in case? If you do just in case, it doesn't contribute to your profit, but Mr. Sasaki will be the expert on that. So that's my impression, but which is to say that if you invest a lot of effort in resilience, in insurance, your shareholders, your stakeholders will ask, what's the payoff? Show me the evidence. So the key here is really time horizon. And it is the same for governments as well. In order for governments to adapt to unpredictability, they need to have the patience to plan for the long term, so that even if short-term actions seem to be costly, they will pay off in the long term. So China's investment in clean energy is one example. In the beginning, it was expensive, wasn't clear it was going to pay off. But when the Iran conflict broke out, China had a much more diversified energy base than if it had never started on the clean energy revolution, right? So you need to have this long time horizon in order to cope with unpredictability, so that you're not excessively distracted by the daily noise up and down, but you have your sights on the pattern in the long term, and really build your policies in a cumulative way toward that direction.
Matthew.
So I would say the part of this is a sort of a return to tradition, I think, that actually historically governments were very focused on sort of the composition of economic activity and providing for the ability to produce things domestically. And I think it goes back to this sense, and I don't want to be too depressing here, but like essentially that was for states existed to wage war, and waging war meant the ability to make things you needed to fight wars. And so that was a preoccupation of governments going back hundreds of years at least. And so in a certain sense, fading away from that and being sort of focused on setting the rules for the game, and as you were saying, I think is sort of a modern sort of luxury benefit of having been in a period of relative peace. And so if you are concerned about reversion of that, it's not unfortunately surprising you get back. So I think in that sense, it's something, it's not completely novel so much as going back to the past. And I think governments also sort of learning from each other and saying what worked, and if they say, oh, well, isn't it nice that they had stockpiles of this, or they had this, or what have you. I think that's part of it. I think the challenge in saying we want to give governments time to learn, or not, is that you don't know when a mistake is being made. Saying we don't want a long.
Sometimes you really know where the mistakes
Well,
are
even then, though, I
being
mean,
made.
I think it's completely right to say that things that are beneficial long term sometimes are not beneficial in the short term. They may be costing. The problem is things that are costing long term are also costing the short term sometimes. So distinguishing between that can be quite tricky. And that I think is going to. I mean, that's not a new problem, obviously, but I think you just have to have people keep iterating. I think hopefully figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with many of those points. I mean, to come back to this Australia example and, our efforts now to shift away from just exporting iron ore to exporting green iron, we're going through this policy learning in real time. We haven't tried to do strategic industrial policy since the 1980s, and that wasn't very successful at that point, and it delegitimized the whole enterprise. Obviously, a few years ago when we started experimenting with this new approach, we really tried to import policy tools from overseas, like production tax incentives, really mirroring what was done with the European New Deal or, the Inflation Reduction Act in America, because we didn't have this industrial policy muscle. We weren't sure of what to do. Those policies haven't worked. And in the recent government budget, a lot of those policies have been done away with. But importantly, what the government hasn't done away with is the goal. So we're now keeping the goal, but experimenting with a new suite of much more domestically attuned, task-appropriate policies focused on both domestic capability building, but also market creation with Japan, with Korea, with China, about standard setting, about collective demand creation, about mandates. So I think it's this kind of learning that is really important, but it speaks to this problem of will governments get the opportunity? Will early failure delegitimize and open the way for those who wouldn't like the goal of the green energy transition to happen to kind of politicize that and argue for a reversion to the fossil fuel order of the past? So I think this question of how much scope governments will have and this time question is so important.
Mr. Sasaki, from the business perspective, how do you see, on the one hand, using national security, if we still use that word, as a decoration for failures of policies? On the other hand, the legitimate need for national security to a certain extent? Certainly, you are welcome to use examples of the businesses that you're experiencing around the world.
Just touch on that, the time horizon issue, and then come back to that, your part. So, yeah, I mean, it's good to say that, from the just in time to the just in case. I think that I love that phrase. But my sense, even in the just in case, there should be the way the companies can make that excess margin. I mean, it's not just the cost. And then there should be, because I'm a strong believer of the entrepreneurship of the business community. They will do, I think, even under the stressful situation, they will find a way to, I think, to get that excess margin. That's a business. That's a spirits, animal spirits. And then, of course, I mean, I'm in the camp that I think quarterly basis earning call that too much. I think I agree. But the 1 year is good or 2 years is good. I have no answer.
Yeah.
So optimal point, business leader through that negotiation, I think they'll find a way of the solution. That's where I'm not academics. I have no statistics, but I'm the strong believer of that side. Yeah. Then, in order to enhance that condition, that foundation, how much government can cooperate? I think that is a settling point that the relationship between private sector and government side. Too much of the intervention may damage that the animal spirits, but just a laissez-faire may not be enough. I think that's quite clear. So then I think that discussion, the healthy dialogue between government, public sector, and the private sector, ongoing dialogue, would be critical. I think that in this stage. That is my answer.
It sounds like common sense, but to do it is not an easy job, isn't it? As we know these days. But what about conversations among governments as well? We used to believe that the governments always talk to one another. That's their job, right? But what about now? It seems that dialogues and mechanisms of dialogues and discussions about policies or even just about common sense have been challenged over the past few years. Are you seeing a repairing back process, or are we still in the very middle of it?
I think it's fair to say, as Klein reminded us, that in a sense we were all traumatized by the pandemic. The pandemic exposed the fragilities of the global system that we took for granted or didn't want to recognize. And I think it's fair to say that all of the governments around the world are still trying to recover, from that very difficult, experience.
Yeah.
With, like you said, the analogy of the snake, the feelings of suspicion and mistrust. It was also an environment that was very zero-sum, right? We all want mass, and if you get it, I don't get it. So I think we still have shadows of that history, which, if you think about it, it's only 5 or 6 years ago.
But at the same time, we shouldn't always blame the government, because sometimes you see businesses go to governments and say, oh, this is something they did. We shouldn't let them do that. And therefore, they're asking favorable policies within their own national borders. And that is also a common practice. Let's just be realistic. So, Mr. Sasaki, what exactly should be the role of businesses as we see things are evolving? Very briefly from you, then we go to the next question.
I think that's as I said, how to grasp the future, I think, should be in the hands of the leaders and CEOs. Leaders are quite responsible, I think, in this stage, because everything is unpredictable. And how to collaborate with the government, how to collaborate with other business leaders, I think that dialogue, of course, they are doing the brutal competition in the day-to-day business. But at the same time, think about that, just a mid to long-term basis. Yeah. How to find the right optimization, I think that will be the role, yeah.
As we speak, we were talking about this in the green room. There is one supply chain expo going on in Beijing as we speak right here. Thousands of companies are participating from all over the world, including in some of the so-called sensitive areas of industry, chips, and the list goes on. And they are talking to one another.
That's exactly the animal speech. I think that they try to optimize themselves, and then but that will create that the unity, and then I think to maximize the total benefit. That's a way. But I think, as I said, just a complete laissez-faire, that may not be the case. But the right coordination across the business leaders with the public sector, I think that will be the key solution in this age. Yeah.
And of course, the public participation.
Public participation is quite.
They want both the security and good life at the same time.
I'm not concerned about that cooperation between private and government, because they are rational to some extent. But I do worry about the cooperation across the government, to be honest. But that's not my field, so.
I'm glad you speak your mind. Yeah. Having said that, though, we promise everybody that
有一个关于 AI 的专题讨论，但是呢，面对这样的巨大的覆盖各个国家、各个行业，涉及到社会安全和国家安全的技术颠覆的时候，我们如何尽可能的充分利用新的创新和技术，让我们能够去逆转或者是抵御闭关锁国的趋势呢？好，先请 Elizabeth 来谈一下，再请其他同事补充。问得很好，确实，AI 无处不在。在美国呢，也在讨论AI 相关的出口是否需要进行更加密切的审查，同时也要考虑到其他国家对 AI 能力的需求，这是一个非常根本性的问题。而且它也会涉及到。
Especially for productivity, especially in the context of aging societies, it will be incredibly important. huge concerns, obviously, about job displacement, so an incredibly complex governance challenge. And then there are the environmental considerations that layered over the top with AI in terms of the enormous power required for it and also the water access around it, and that brings in the questions of social license as well. I was just reading in the newspaper this morning in Australia a proposed data centre in a kind of a heritage-listed site and enormous concerns about the implications there. Socially. So the question of how we govern this is really vital. National capabilities will very much matter. From my perspective, being concerned with energy transition governance, I think that we should move towards AI being born green. All new AI capacity being fueled with renewable energy would be an excellent first step, because we can't just think about the military security and the economic security. We have to think about the environmental security as well.
Right.
So I live in San Francisco, where AI that's certainly been a live topic, and it's interesting because on the one hand there is this sort of national element of it, where Europeans particularly feel like they don't have AI. There's the sort of the Chinese AI models and the US AI models, but the actual people who work in AI are all over the world. It's very international in that sense. The supply chains for the data centers are extremely international. So even if many of the data centers are being built, I think, disproportionately in the US, although not only in the US, the parts come from Korea and Taiwan and Japan and all sorts of other places as well. Sometimes exclusively, right? I mean, I think the DRAM overwhelmingly comes from Samsung and SK Hynix almost alone. So that's an interesting element of, on the one hand, extreme levels of dependence on one producer. The power sources, right? To the extent that much of the energy is not coming from renewables, it is also globally traded. So, I mean, there's some coal, like this is local, but a lot of it is gas or oil or other things. And so the mix of, and then the software, in theory, anyone could use the software, but in practice, as we've seen, there are limits on, who can be allowed to or is willing to use software from different places. And so the locations of where the companies are that actually write the software, where the data centers are, where the parts of these things, it becomes very complex very quickly. And so, it's definitely not conducive to an autarkic system. There is no society that can produce all the things at once simultaneously and has yet. But you see a lot of different fractures across the software, across the supply chain, across the energy, and that makes it and across the people. That makes it challenging.
It's very interesting. You mentioned the many factors related to AI these days, whether it is raw materials, the supply chains, and talent. And you see they are being artificially separated in a way. This is really a unique phenomenon over the past few decades, shall we say. But as the talents are so much from everywhere in the world, we also see that in China, see it in the US, see it in Japan, Korea, and South Korea, and many other places. But the question is, how could policies say only people from this country can use this, people from that country cannot use this? It's becoming such a very unique phenomenon, shall we say, just of our time. Having said that, though, Mr. Sasaki, about businesses, there has been different approaches. One is so-called reaching for the star, the AGI and everything, and the other is AI Plus, which we see in China and elsewhere in Asia. How do you see these different approaches, in a way, could help us to tackle the ultimate question we asked at the very beginning, resisting autarky?
Let me frame this way. So the application, LLM, the competition is going on. And then the next is data layer. I think that is also linked to that national interest. And then here in China, I think that developed that very unique, strong ecosystem. It's quite strong. But is it really the matter of the global coordination? That is a really open discussion. I think that I'm not naive enough to say that the data layer part is strongly linked to that the national interest. So I think that kind of competition will continue. But I'm really more concerned about that, the code of the responsible AI. That has been a topic of the web for long now. It's beyond that, national interest. It's AI. It might be the threat to us human beings. And how do we coordinate that level? I think that is more the concern to me. And then be above that, I think that we will do. As I said, I'm a strong believer of the animal spirit. So I think we may coordinate in the right way. But the responsible AI part, I think unless we have some good forum, it might be quite scary. That's my honest view.
Very important point. We see the two presidents of China and United States met earlier this year, and they have agreed among many of the talking points, I look at every one of them very carefully. One is track one dialogue on AI governance. Of course, we are yet to see what is the outcome in the public, but how important it is that the AI powers are talking to one another on governance issues, at least on coordination of governance issues. And what would that mean to help us resist autarky?
Many AI conversations today, it's popular to apply a almost Cold War mindset, like this is a Sputnik race, and the competition is who is going to have the most advanced, powerful models. The new release, is the fastest and the strongest. It's a Cold War mindset that it's similar to an autarky kind of mindset. But a different way to understand AI is that there's a very different layer of competition, if you could say that, but it's also very collaborative, which is it's more important to take the existing knowledge of AI concentrated in the US and China and think about how can you integrate it into society, integrate it into business operations, into higher education, into even elderly care, healthcare, and all aspects of life. That is the integration and application layer that I think has not gotten enough attention, and where it's not a competition in the sense that if China integrates AI well, that doesn't mean the US cannot do it. In fact, the US can then learn from China and vice versa as well. So maybe we need to move away from this Cold War mindset. Someone is going to reach the moon first, and realize that the technology is powerful and existing, but there is so much room for thinking creatively about how we can use this technology well for all aspects of social life.
Is Yue too idealistic?
Idealistic, oh.
I don't think so. That's a very much important question. But at the same time, no need to refrain that competition. Competition is necessary, and then that will create that new value.
Yeah.
But the more the fundamental coordination will be necessary, particularly for the AI, because that's such a very important technology we are facing today.
Related to the competition, I was doing some interviews, of course, over the past few years on AI. And some industry experts have been talking to me, and I would love to quote him right now. He said, there should be more great competition between businesses, among businesses. But there should not be competition among governments for having more regulations than one another, especially toward one another. So that's an interesting quote I got from policy, from business and also industry expert. Elizabeth, your thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, look, I think that competition between governments in some respects isn't necessarily a bad thing. If we look at the countries, for example, that have delivered some of the most incredible transformative economic development experiences. So at the end of World War II, Japan, Korea, these governments were in large part driven by an incredible desire to catch up with the West. That is an inherently competitive drive, and it was an enormously productive drive, and it wasn't seen through a zero-sum lens. And I think, coming back to this open door, closed door analogy, this was a way, a kind of positive, if we look to Japan, we look to Korea, a kind of positive economic nationalism, whereby these governments were very much focused on the question of how to transform the industrial structure of the nation and how to lift millions of people out of poverty in a very quick time. And that was done through a kind of managed openness in a way. So it was about about acknowledging that there are enormous gains to be made through trade. Exporting is hugely important.
Right.
And if you want to export, you have to maintain an open market as well. There are enormous gains to be made from foreign investment. There are enormous gains to be made from technology transfer. But the question is how you put the guardrails in place to ensure that that doesn't spill over into negative domestic, social and economic consequences.
Matthew and then Yue.
I just think the challenge with AI is that a lot of the people who work in AI are convinced that it is the next nuclear weapon and has the high risk of annihilating humanity. And so that automatically complicates the conversations among governments and how they think about it, because if it is in fact a benign kind of new form of software that improves productivity at the margin, and that's great, obviously there's no need to feel like it's a Cold War dynamic or competitive or anything of that nature. But if the people in the industry themselves, rightly or wrongly, I have no view, but enough of them seem to think that this is extremely potentially destructive, that obviously is going to color the conversation. And I think also, unfortunately, regardless of whether governments can cooperate in the regulation, I don't even think any individual government has shown its ability to come up with a convincing framework of how to regulate AI in a way that is, mitigates the risks in a way and maximize the benefits, much less how they coordinate their own development. So I think that creates potentially a very significant challenge.
The thoughts of autarky has created a fragmentation of the supply chains all over the world we have seen, but this time also fall on the issue of artificial intelligence. And yet, the further it is down that road, we are seeing more danger of autarky. This is like a vicious cycle that we are talking about. So what is the best ingredient right now, knowing the danger of autarky, and therefore taking advantage of the tools of AI to put at least a pause? Earlier we talked about the government-to-government discussion, even among the two biggest powers, but the other economies too. We've been seeing economies hedging between the two economic power, China and United States, as an approach. So what might be the most pragmatic way and the forward-looking way? Yue, I would love to hear your thoughts on that before we wrap it up for everybody.
Sure. I think I'll come back to my original point, which is that geoeconomic tools is really a big power luxury. Only very few countries can deploy these kinds of tools. And so the relevant policy for the rest of the world is how do you build internal resilience, internal absorptive capacity to deal with the shocks of being integrated. So I'll just rest the point here so that we're not fixated on autarky. Yes.
That's a great point. Final words from you also, Matthew.
I think the appeal of self-sufficiency or insurance or autarky would go down if people felt safer, and to the extent that governments and societies can do things to reduce the risks that make people want to have that self-insurance, that would be better for everyone.
Elizabeth.
I think the biggest takeaway for me would be that while we're very much focused at the moment on geostrategic security concerns, and this is driving this autarkic turn, if you like, that national security is much broader. It's not just about military security, it's about economic and energy and environmental and social security. And across this comprehensive security dimension, you cannot maximize those with a closed economy. The existential challenge is climate change. That cannot be addressed by any country acting alone. So it's prosperity, comprehensive prosperity is about productive collaboration.
Yeah, yes.
Well, healthy discussion with the multi layers, government, private sectors, I think that would be the starting point. That's why we are here. I really could refresh my own thinking by having this discussion. But that is a starting point. Unless we have the right understanding with others, we'll never be able to reach that, the cooperation consensus. Yeah.
One thing I have learned from all our capable panelists today is not to reach conclusion too soon. There are a lot of efforts that need to be made in order to make things better, arguably for everyone. I want to thank all of you for your contribution and your insights. Really appreciate it. This has been a joint production of World Economic Forum and CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Thank you for being with me and our panelists.